Hi, I'm John Shent with VistaSense Solutions. Welcome back. Today we're going to get a little bit deeper into the gateway's internals and specifically looking at some of the policy assertions that we'll be working with. We're going to go a little bit into a term that I like to call thinking in policy, and it's something that Broadcom pushes heavily when they start training on API gateway resources. What we've got up here right now is the similar windows from what we had in our last video, going through some of the architecture. And so just as a quick recap, you'll notice that in our use case, the services or applications on the left are accessing services and applications on the right through the gateway. So everything's going left to right through the gateway, and there are routes established on this gateway that can navigate to various resources. So in this case, we have test 1, test 2, and test 3. All of these are present as service endpoints on the gateway. And you can see that over here, where we have LB check, we have success, we have our YouTube test that we created, I still haven't gotten rid of that, and several others. So when a user accesses, for instance, LB check, so the gateway URL / LB check, that will navigate to this policy, which may route to a service. Now we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. So how do we know when a route is supposed to navigate to a certain endpoint? When we start talking about concepts like access control and routing decisions and things that we'll get into in a later video, we have the concept of assertions, and it's something that I've mentioned a couple times. An assertion being rooted in computer science and mathematics as either a true or false. So it's an expression that evaluates the true or false. So if you think about the assertion 1 + 1 = 2, that would evaluate to true. If you said 2 + 2 = 5, that assertion would evaluate to false. And so there are many different ways and implementations you can have an assertion, not just in the gateway, but in computer science and programming languages, in math. There's, the possibilities are endless. But I want to focus today on the Layer 7 implementation, which is a very pure true or false decision. So we're going to move over here. We're going to talk about ors and ands. Now again, this is based in mathematics, heavily used in computer science. These are logic decisions. And so the concept of or and, when you have two things you are comparing. So in the case of 1 + 1 = 2, 1 + 1 is on one side, 2 is on the other side. We're going to see if those two are equal. When we look at or statements or and statements, those two terms get used a little differently, and they have a little different result. So if we are talking about a relationship between two terms, if an assertion is either true or false, 1 + 1 = 2, or 2 + 2 = 4, if either one of those are true, an or statement, so that or that, will evaluate to true. And so when we talk about a car, if this car is red or this car is blue, that statement right there is true if the car is red or if the car is blue. So it's a much more inclusive statement. As you can see, many more things are evaluating to true. The car only has to be red or the car has to be blue. It doesn't have to be both. If it's neither, then that statement is false. The slightly more constraining terminology is and. So if we go back to our car analogy, the car is red and the car is blue. That only happens if the car is red and blue. I know it makes sense. If the car is just red, or if the car is just blue, or if the car is green, that statement is false. So this helps guide and understand a little bit more about how we create policies and how this all kind of comes together. So when we were talking about the Layer 7 API gateway, what we want to understand is how these ors and ands are expressed in policy. So again, everything is a combination of trues and falses, and it goes right down the list from assertion number 1 all the way down to your last assertion. And so we have this concept down here, and I'll actually probably just expand this a little bit more so we can have this up a little more often. So there are folder structures in the gateway, and we're going to create a service endpoint here and show what's going on. But we've got this concept of at least one assertion must evaluate to true, or all assertions must evaluate to true. And that is the representation of or statements or and statements. So let's start, and maybe this will start making a little bit more sense if you haven't caught on yet. So we are going to create a policy logic test. We're going to call it policy logic, so we can reach this URL through this IP/policy logic. And I'm not going to go through any other configuration. I'm just going to hit finish. We're going to get a blank page. Here we are, blank page. And so now we're going to use the assertions to set up some things. So we're going to start with context variables, and this is where we start actually talking about what the assertions are and what they do. So context variable, if you're familiar with programming languages, is the same thing as a local variable. Its scope is local to this policy, means it is created in this policy and it is destroyed in this policy. API gateway policies are stateless by default, so they do not carry their values or variables from request to request. Everything starts at the beginning, brand new clean slate. So let's call this term 1. And we're just going to make term 1 a string. It's going to be set to true. You'll notice in here there's no Boolean. There are ways to express this as Boolean, but from now we're just going to use a string that equals true. And we're going to create 2 of those because we're going to start simulating ors and and statements. So we're going to say term 1 and term 2. So we've got our information. We've got our context variables set. These are the variables that we're going to be using throughout this policy. Now when I hover over this, you'll see a little tooltip come up, and it says sets term 1, but it's got a $ and squiggly braces, or brackets, however you'd like to call it, in its as its notation. So this is how you reference variables in the API gateway, in the policy manager. We'll talk about what that looks like in just a second. So if we want to express an or statement, if one of these evaluates to true, we're going to go down here and say, oh, that's at least 1. So we're going to right click. Now there's a couple ways to do this. I'm going to show you every way we can do this right now. So you can right click and go to at least 1, and that will create that folder structure. We can delete this. We can go into the assertion list and search for it and drag it down in here. 2 ways to do it. I tend to just right click. It makes it a little easier for me. And now we've got this. So we've got this or folder. We'll just call it an or folder for right now. So how do we know that we're talking about these 2 terms? How do we know which 2 terms we even want to look at? So we're going to bring in another assertion, and it's going to be called compare expression. This assertion allows us to bring in and compare any variables or expressions. So let's start by making a very simple comparison here. And we are going to say term 1. And if you'll notice, I'm using the notation. So $, squiggly bracket, term1, and squiggly bracket. For this instance, we're not going to care too much about the data type or multi-value. We'll talk about that a little later. But we're going to create a rule. Now, a rule in comparison is a way to determine the right side of that equation. So for term 1, we say is equal to true. And we're just going to hit OK and OK. And now we've got this compare variable. Term 1 is equal to true. We're going to do that as well for term 2. So I do want to back up. We can copy paste in all of these, so that's what I'm doing. I'm just Control-C, Control-V. And now we've got this expression where at least one of these assertions must evaluate to true. Easy peasy, that's it. Now we're going to set up a little bit of a debug expression where we are going to bring this all the way back to the client. We're going to use text plain, charset UTF-8. Pretty much the only thing we removed was the XML, and we changed it to text plain. And we're going to say term 1. We're going to make a little break in there, term 2, and then true. I'll show you why we put true in there in a second. All this is just plain text. And I'm going to remember to move this outside. So this is one of the nuances with the policy manager, is sometimes if you have folders expanded and it's the last assertion in your policy, you go to add another assertion, it's going to move it into that folder. So I'd say it's best practice to put collapse your folders as you're finishing up. And we'll put a comment in here because that's best practice. And we'll say test or, because this is an or. And we're going to make sure we save and activate. So always save and activate. So notice we're at 2 of 2. We just made that change. We're active. We should be good here. So let's go over. Let's run this. So we come in here. Fantastic. Our term 1 is true. Our term 2 is true. And the response that we put in is true. Now we can come in. We can change this to false. Save and activate. Refresh this. Now you see we've got false. True, true. Let's change that back to true. And we'll change this to false. And get the same thing. So far, we've looked at if both are true and if one is false and the other is true. We haven't tested this yet. So let's modify this to false. So now we've got 2 falses. Let's see what happens. SOAP fault. This is our first SOAP fault that we have ever showed on this channel. So I don't know who needs to set off some fireworks or whatever. So when we were talking about the gateway, and we said all of these assertions have to evaluate to true to continue on down the line. It goes from top to bottom. Once it hits a false at this top level, it's going to fail. That's what we're getting here. The policy was falsified. So this ends up being an assertion as well. Even though we have other assertions in here that we're comparing, this is assertion number 4. So it gets evaluated as a single assertion. So it's got to evaluate to true in order to get down to this template response that we send out. This is the whole thing that we figure out when we're developing policies. Now there are some ways to make this go away. The one that we use typically is continue processing. And there are several assertions like this that will always evaluate to true. And so by having a third process or a third assertion that we're comparing that's going to always evaluate to true, this will always evaluate to true. So we can come back in here and we can say, even though this is false and false, there is a third term that we are comparing here, and that always evaluates to true. So we're coming back as true. Now typically that's unexpected behavior, or that's undesired behavior, something we wouldn't want to do. So how can we figure this out? How can we make so this may evaluate to false, but we can still get through with only the two terms? Now the lovely part about this is we can nest these assertions and nest these comparisons. And so now we can say, well, only one of these has to evaluate to true. So in this case, this will evaluate to false. So this assertion evaluates to false. Now this is assertion 5. Which means we need to make something in here that will evaluate to true. So we can put that in there just as easy. And so now we can run this, and we'll still get false, false, true, which is exactly what we're expecting. But now we've got a different method of testing things. So now we can say, well, if this or something else. So now we can come in with, put that in the wrong spot. So now we can come in here and add another test up here. We can move that to the top. We can come in, and let's copy these. And let's say this is equal to so now if both are true or the first term is false and the second term is true, then we will evaluate this policy to the end. So this is where we start getting a little bit more complicated. So in this case, we see that term 1 or term 2 are equal to true, which in this case they're not, or term 1 or term 2, well, term 1 is false or term 2 is true. Because term 1 is false, this evaluates to true, which means we get to a correct response here. This is where this is where it's really good to practice this logic structure. And this is just the or. We haven't even gotten to the end yet. Or is typically the more difficult of the patterns to express here. It's just a little bit more abstract. It's easy to think that all of these have to evaluate to true. And so if we put something, let's see, since this is a string, we can say third. So now there's a third option that we're not even sure about. We're going to get that fault back again because this statement is not true and this statement is not true. So let's put this back because we don't like having a ton of strangeness happening. So let's get back to a relatively good state. And now we've kind of showed you some of the capabilities of this at least one assertion, or what I call an OR folder. There's one more thing to note about this, and that is the gateway short circuits its logic flows on OR. So in an OR statement, if we're comparing two fields here, let's simplify this a little bit. If we compare two fields, if this first field, if this first comparison evaluates to true, and by that I mean the assertion evaluates to true, it will not navigate to this at all. It's not going to check both or check all of them and see if one of them equals true. The first thing that equals true, it's going to pop out of this folder and it's going to say this evaluates to true. So when you're creating policies, especially when you start thinking about performance, but also the expected flow that your policy is going to have, remember that you've got a short circuit capability where the first true is going to kick you out of this folder and evaluate the folder to true. Okay. That was OR. Feel free to ask questions in the comments. This is 80% of the difficult part about writing policy, is understanding this logic flow, understanding how this works. So, getting back to our lovely diagram here, we've also got and is the all assertions folder. So let's bring that up to the same spot where our OR was, and just like we did with our OR, we're going to add a couple comparisons. Term 1, simple comparison, true. And we're going to do this for term 2 as well. Save and activate. Again, working with all this time, so this is going to be a test and. So this is the second part of that logic. So we have the ability to look at both of these, say, let's make one more quick change on our gateway, because we want to make sure that these are not false. So we're going to clean up from our OR case. So these are both true now. So if we went to, if 1 is true and 2 is true, this should evaluate to true. Let's see what happens. There we go. Everything's true. Now looking back at our diagram, if one of these variables is false, then this whole statement should evaluate to false. So let's make some changes. So if 1 is false, we're going to fail. Let's change this back to true. And we'll change this to false. False again. Let's change them both to false. Both false. Everything's false. We don't like this. So now that we've kind of showed what both OR and statements, or the at least one and all evaluates true, we can understand a little bit more about error handling. We can understand a little bit more about the logic flow. So let's expand on this a little. So we said that all of these assertions must evaluate to true. So if we came out with a 3 and a 4 and a 5 and a 6 and a 12 and a 13 and a 97, there's no short circuiting like there is in the at least one or the OR folder. So the gateway is going to evaluate all of these, but as soon as one evaluates to false, it kicks out. So it's the opposite type of short circuiting. It's not going to look for the first true, it's going to look for the first false. So we'll get rid of all that. So the last thing that I want to talk about is the ability to nest some of these logic flows and how we can get rid of this response and insert something that's a little bit more friendly, a little bit more meaningful to the user, Most users, if they see a SOAP fault, they're going to assume that there's something wrong that they can't fix, that they don't have access to. And this doesn't give us a lot of information about what was going on. So what we can do here is look at our and say, okay, if this evaluates to false, we're not even going to get here. So what's something that helps us get here? It's going to be an OR. So let's create an OR. Let's name this. It's test OR. We're going to bring this in. And we're going to say if this evaluates to true, then we would go down to the next assertion, except for this pops out, at least one assertion must evaluate to true. So when we're talking about things, specifically assertions that always evaluate to true, the return template response is also an assertion, and it always evaluates to true. So we can actually rope this in, drag this into our AND block, and say term 1, term 2, true. And if we want, we could create a second response and say that's a false. So now walking through this logic, one of these statements has to evaluate to true in order to not get one of these responses. When we look at, let's look at the first assertion, which is all assertions must evaluate to true. We can say, okay, if term 1 is equal to 2, true, term 2 is equal to true, we'll keep on going until we hit a false or until we're done with the assertions. And so in that case, we'll actually hit this return template response. If one of these is false, we won't hit this template response. And so then we pop out, we're in our OR still, says, okay, access this template response instead, which always evaluates to true, but it's going to send that response back saying false. So this is where it gets, again, this is a little abstract, but understanding these concepts and practicing these concepts is extremely important. So here we can see false, false, false. So both term 1, term true are equal to false. We did not pass the AND, so we go into the false. If we set one of these to true, we get a true false, still not true. If we set both of these to true, 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 true. So having a little testbed like this ends up being really, really helpful. So you can start looking at what some of the capabilities, combinations, and ultimately start building out a policy where you have some sort of response that comes back saying this is true, this is false. Now, for testing purposes, we've created this return template response, but this can be anything. This can be a route that we create, which we'll talk about routes in the next video. This can be more policy logic, so we can build this out even further. Term 1 and term 2 don't have to be strings. They can be responses that you receive from something else. They can be user input. All this is creating variables, comparing those variables, and then outputting the result. That's all we're doing today. So I want to thank you all for your time. Feel free to comment on this video, give us a like and a subscribe, because that's the cool thing to do. You'll notice we also have some branded swag, and so we're going to be making an announcement on our LinkedIn about some of the swag that we've got, and I'm excited to share that and some of the fun things we've been working on. So again, thank you for the time. Have a great rest of your day.